The next thing I want to share with you is some of my own personal work. Um, I went out and I created some posters a few years ago, and one of the kind of journeys that I've been on personally the last few years is expanding my own creative processes to include working with non-traditional materials. And so what I realized was, as I was wrapping my head around these projects, I was inspired by the work of Sagmeister and Walsh and the fun they were having, and different designers that were also kind of using non-traditional materials. And I started, encouraging students to do this as well. But I realized that in my own practice, I'd never done anything like that. I didn't have any personal experience with it myself. So I wanted to take this on and I wanted to try it myself, but I didn't want to just do the projects that I give you, because if I showed examples of how I interpret the projects, then a lot of you would be like, oh, that's what Todd wants me to do, right? And I didn't want that to be a confusing thing. So I actually wear a lot of hats in my life. I'm a professor, I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a hockey coach, but I consider myself a bit of an environmentalist too. I have a master's degree in environmental studies. I was trained by former US Vice President Al Gore to do his climate talks. And so now I volunteer my time to do talks on climate change. And I'm a mentor to about 500 different climate leaders in Southern Ontario that have also kind of done the same training as I have. And so, I thought, when I was trying to think of like work that I wanted to do, I thought, the sustainability thing is something that I think I can help other people to understand, or to put communications out into the world. I had no idea what I would do with these posters, but I wanted to create something. But really what it was all about was documenting the process so that I could come back to you guys and share this with my students and say, not only am I asking you to do it, but I also understand what's involved in doing it, and let's work through this together. So I've put together a presentation here of some posters that I created, and I want to walk you through what that process looked like. Okay, so share my screen with you again. And these are the posters that I ended up creating. So what happened was, a few years ago, I was invited to what was called a residency, a design educator's residency. It was 1 week. It was down in the US. It was in Maine, in the state of Maine. It was on a farm on an island off the coast of Maine. And it was 1 week. There was no internet connection. Can you imagine having zero internet connection for a whole 7 days, right? I had no distractions from my family. They didn't join me. I was by myself. I was with these other design educators, and it was glorious. It was amazing. Like, I was awake. I was wide awake at like 6 a.m. every day. And I'm not a morning person. It was just so bizarre. Anyways, we had breakfast with each other and we had dinner with each other, but then during the day and at night, we were allowed to kind of go off and work on whatever we wanted. And the other design educators that were there was about a dozen of us. Most of them were working on research. They were like reading and writing things, but I actually wanted to produce something. So I came up with this concept for these posters, and I used the 1 week while I was away to physically create these posters and to design them. And so the communications that are here are, I knew that the concept was that I wanted the same words on each poster, but that the materials that I used would help to tell the story about the messaging I was trying to get across, right? So when we look at Sagmeister and Walsh's work, oftentimes they're playing with different materials, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the messaging. It's just about playing with different materials. I wanted the materials here to be specific to the message that was coming across. And I kind of see that in the project that you guys are working on right now too. So just to go across on the left, this is the process that I'm saying is not sustainable is electricity that is generated by coal-fired power plants, that from burning of coal. And so this is a series of light bulbs that are sitting on a bed of coal. It's a little bit hard to see it, but you'll see it in a moment as I'm putting together. The second one, a lot of people mistakenly think that this is about eating meat, and I'm not a vegetarian myself, so it'd be hypocritical of me to tell people not to eat meat. But what it's really about is industrial farming practices. So this is beef that's been cut out into the shape of letters, and it's sitting on a bed of cornmeal, and cornmeal is kind of the most popular meal that they use in industrial farming practices. And the last one is about oil consumption, and it's meant to kind of replicate an oil spill. So let's talk about how these came together for me. So to start off, let me go full screen here. So here's a bunch of images just to kind of set the tone for where I was. The house in the middle was the one that we were staying in. It was called a farm, but it wasn't really a working farm. It was called the Poor Farm. And the building on the left is where all the bedrooms were. And then the main house and dining area and that was all over here. And so you can see us inside having dinner together. We had lobster one night. And this was a desk I set up for myself to work on throughout the week. The Poor Farm, apparently it was housing for homeless people for many years, like turn of the century, like late 1800s, early 1900s. The building's been there for years, for over a century. And apparently it's haunted. I didn't see any ghosts myself, but apparently the place is haunted. So it was really cool. It was a really beautiful place, very serene, and lovely to kind of get away. So going there, I had this idea of the different posters I wanted to make, but they were all going to flush out as I got there. But this was the one that I had kind of worked out the most. I brought a Rubbermaid bin with me that was just full of different materials that I thought I might be able to use. I had this idea of the light bulbs and the coal, but I don't have the knowledge or the wherewithal to wire up, all of the different light bulbs and to set this up physically. So I thought a simpler way of doing that might be to use Christmas lights. And so I had a couple different styles of Christmas lights. I really like these bigger bulbs that looked more like light bulbs, but I had these smaller ones to fall back on just in case. And then I was kind of figuring out how close can I put them together. I thought if I drilled holes in wood and then that would hold them in place. And then how close could I get them to each other? How far apart could they be before they started to kind of not be legible? And you can see me kind of printing out and drawing the actual shapes on the letters to try and figure it all out. And I wanted to work with the big bulbs, but given the number of bulbs and how close I could or couldn't get them to each other, this was the result on the left where I did it digitally on the screen. And I realized that it just wasn't legible. Not only was it not sustainable, it wasn't legible. And so I realized that I had to work with the smaller bulbs, but it was okay because I could get them closer together, and I could really define the shapes of these letter forms. So this is digitally, I created this in Illustrator and then printed these out. I didn't even know what size to work with. So this is really all predicated by the light bulbs and how many I had and how closely I could make them. And so I printed them out, tiled it all up and taped these things down to a couple pieces of wood and brought them out to the barn. And I worked in the barn for this one. And you can see I just took the drill and I literally just drilled through the paper so that I would have them in the spots where I wanted them to be. And then took the paper off and flipped the board over and put the lights through and used a staple gun to keep those cords where I wanted them to be. And you can see the results here before I put the coal on, that it's quite legible. Spacing worked out nicely. And then the coal is just barbecue coal. You can get like charcoal briquettes, but you can also get this loose charcoal from some people and from some manufacturers. And I just bought a bag of the loose coal. And you can see how I kind of spread it all out. And I turned the lights on to see if it was legible, and it was. But I realized that there was too much light pollution. Even in the barn with the doors closed, there was like cracks in the barn between slats of wood, and there was windows, and it just wasn't dark enough to be able to photograph it properly. So I had to come back at night, and I worked after the sun went down. And this is about 2/3 of the photos that I took. I don't have a DSLR camera. I have a decent camera. It's better than the one on my phone, and it has a bunch of settings in it, but I'm not a photographer. And so I basically and the screen on the back of the phone was really small. I couldn't tell if they were good photos or not. So I just went through and I used every setting I could come up with on the phone. And so these have different colors to them, not because they've changed. It's just the way that the camera is interpreting different lighting effects, different settings on the camera, and not really knowing what I was looking at until I actually got them back into the house and pulled them up on my laptop so I could see these images well, because I wasn't really seeing it in person. It's all about what the camera was capturing, right? And when I looked at them on the screen, I realized that some of the bulbs were brighter than others. So the ones at the top here were actually brighter. They were two different sets of bulbs that came from two different manufacturers. And to the naked eye, I couldn't tell when I was looking at it. But when I photographed it, I realized this was quite obviously different, and I didn't like it. And I was really frustrated. I went to bed that night really frustrated with myself because it wasn't good enough. And I was trying to think of how I could make this work. You can even see right through the middle of the N is where it changed from one strand of bulbs to the other. And I wasn't happy with it. So the next day I went out and I took the top apart where the brighter bulbs were all on the top half. So I took that apart, and then I counted how many bulbs I had on the less bright ones, but I didn't have enough to do all of it. So I had to use the brighter bulbs to some capacity. And so I decided that if I was able to pull the less bright bulbs up and do the word this, and then the two words is not, do them in the brighter bulbs, it might be kind of like bolding, if you will. Like I've bolded those two words and made them so it's like, this is not sustainable. So, it wasn't ideal. It wasn't what I'd hoped for or planned for, but it was a compromise where it would still work. So I put it all back together again. I just took like more than 100 photographs and just all these different settings of figuring out what was going to work for me. And I also realized that, I didn't know how big these posters were going to be. I didn't know if I wanted them to be on billboards or if I wanted them to be on like low res Instagrams. I didn't know. So you can't make something a lot more bigger than it is, but you can make it smaller without losing any quality. So what I decided to do was to photograph it 3 times as close as I could. And then instead of capturing it all in one shot, I photographed it 3 different times so that I could splice it together in Photoshop. And so this is just indicating how there's 3 images and on the layers and how I spliced it together fairly well. I think it worked out pretty good. It seems pretty seamless. And the one in the middle here is kind of what I had done during the week that I was there. And I showed it to all 3 of these when they were done to my colleagues that were there. And one of the other teachers had a good suggestion. He said, as lovely as these are, they might not be totally clear about what people are looking at. Maybe you can add some words into the posters to kind of really hit home about the messaging that you're trying to get across. And so you'll notice this one has a logo at the bottom for the Climate Reality Project. That's Al Gore's organization out of the US, and I volunteer for the Canadian branch of it. And so I approached them and I said, I've created these posters. Do you think you could use them? I didn't really the only reason I created these posters was so that I could share it with you guys, with my students, but maybe these could have a life. And so I contacted them and I said, do you think that you could use these for promotional purposes? And they're like, yeah, these are amazing. And so I came up with the words and they helped me edit them down to tell the story that we wanted to tell. And then in exchange for me putting their logo on the poster, I said, maybe you could help me pay for the cost of printing. These ended up being about 3 feet wide and about 5 feet tall. They're huge posters, but each one cost about $75 to print and mount. And so they're not cheap. And so thankfully they were willing to pay for one printing of them. So I've got 1 copy of each of these posters printed. They're actually hanging at the in the Learning Commons at the Mississauga campus for Sheridan. So if you're ever over by Square One, and you walk up to Sheridan, you can actually see them through the windows from the sidewalk. They're in the Learning Commons if you're ever over there, and these 3 posters are hanging there. They were only supposed to be hanging up for a month, but they didn't have anything else to put up, so they've been there ever since. They've been up for a few years now. And then COVID happened, and they just So the next one I wanted to do was the oil one. That was the one I had kind of formulated the most about how I wanted to do it. But the morning I woke up to do that, it was pouring rain outside, and so I didn't want to be going around in the rain. So I shifted gears a bit. And this one I had kind of a rough idea of, I knew I wanted to do something with food, and I had a couple of different approaches that I wanted to do. So I ended up going to, there was a general store on the island. There was like a little market on the island. I went there and looked around. I found these amazing roasts that they had that had all this marbling in the meat and everything. And they weren't that expensive. I think each one was maybe like $6 or $7. So I didn't end up having to spend a lot of money. And then I discovered through my research, I kind of got on my phone while I was there and discovered that corn feed is what they use for the feed in a lot of these industrial places. So this is actually like bird corn feed. This is like for feeding birds, but it's corn. It looks like corn, and so it might not be exactly what they use in the industrial farming practices, but it's about the messaging. And then I knew I couldn't just pour this stuff out because it would just go everywhere. And I needed kind of a frame to hold it all in place. So I ended up using the lid from the Rubbermaid container that I brought and filled that. And that created kind of a frame and a size, which then I could kind of measure out and figure out how big the letters could be to fit on that so that I could photograph. And then I kind of worked backwards to create the letter forms and to cut them out. So I tried a bunch of different knives. I tried kitchen knives, I tried steak knives, and I ultimately found that my X-Acto blade was the best one for cutting out the meat. But I fucked up. I totally messed up. I didn't take any more pictures than this. I totally got wrapped up in the process of cutting it and doing everything and figuring everything out that I didn't take any more pictures than this, and which kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing this. But one of the other educators that was there, he was one of the things he wanted to work on while he was on this retreat was to work on his photography skills. And he asked each of us that were there if he could do a portrait of us doing our work. And so I got this lovely photograph out of it, where he photographed me creating this poster, and I love it. It's a lovely picture, and you can see I'm working in the barn, and there's it's kind of a hazy, rainy day on the outside, but I love the lighting on it, and it just worked out really well. So again, I took a whole bunch of photographs, lighting it different ways, using natural light, using flashes in the barn. I ended up bringing it out into the driveway when it stopped raining, and just using natural light was the best way to do it. And because this was smaller, I could get closer to the words, and I decided I didn't need to do 3 shots. I could get away with just doing 2 shots, and then Photoshop those together fairly seamlessly. And I even was able to get rid of the edges of that Rubbermaid container and continue the background out. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. On the poster, it looks pretty seamless in the final, and I left room. I was able to give myself room at the bottom to add the typography. So for the oil one, I had this idea before I left to go to Maine. I did all kinds of research into what oil spills look like when they reach the shore. What does the oil look like when it hits the sand? And all these amazing images that I found, just really disturbing images though, of like oil and sand and how it mixes and what it looked like. And we've all seen the horrible images of animals that get caught up in it and stuff. So I was all excited. I had an idea of how this poster was going to end up looking like. And then I got to Maine and I realized there was no beaches where I was. It was the farm was on the waterfront, but it was all rock, and there was no beaches. And you can see up here how far out the water goes when the tide was out, and then it would come in and all of this would be underwater. So the tide was huge. It went way out and then came right in again. And obviously I didn't want to actually put oil in the water. I didn't want to stain or put oil on actual oil. So I had to come up with a concoction that I was confident would be biodegradable. And so these images at the bottom. I didn't have a notebook with me while I'm out there. I just had the materials that I had to work with. I put different ingredients into different bottles, and I labeled the bottles with the ingredients and then put it down on the surface and then photographed it next to it. So this is me taking notes, right? And just documenting everything through camera so that I could go back and I could look at things later and know which ones worked and which ones didn't. And I'm trying it on different surfaces and trying different ways of doing things, and trying it on rocks, trying it in mud. This one's gray over here, but I thought maybe I could manipulate it in Photoshop later. I tried different techniques of like pouring it right out of the bottle or brushing it on with my finger or a paintbrush, and different techniques in that. And then I found this one rock. And so just a little side note here, I totally learned something on this trip that I didn't know going into it. I grew up in Ontario. I grew up on Lake Superior and Lake Ontario. I don't know anything about tides, right? Those of you who live close to oceans or have been at the oceans probably have a better understanding. I didn't know how tides worked. And I was fascinated by like these early images of like how far out, how much would be exposed when the tide went out. And then all of this would be submerged by water. And I remember one morning I was sitting out having a coffee with one of the other teachers in the morning, and we're looking out the water, and I'm like, the tide, like, it's fascinating. And he's like, oh yeah, here you could really see the tide go out and come in. I'm like, how often does that happen? Like, is it every few days? And he just looked at me like, are you trying to be stupid? Are you like, are you joking? I said, no, I have no idea. And turns out the tide goes out over the course of 6 hours. And then over the course of the next 6 hours, it comes back in. So the tide goes out and comes back in twice every day. And it's totally about the relationship with the moon, and how the tide works. And so every day the tide goes out and comes in and it takes 6 hours to do it. So I found this one rock that I knew through observation would be completely submerged by when the tide came in. And I knew the angle at which the water was coming. So I found this flat surface, and I ended up using a concoction of like, it was a water-based India ink and some flour and water to give it a bit of thickness, and ended up just painting it right on this rock, and kind of created these lines at the bottom to make it look like maybe it had been spilled a little bit. And then I sat there for 4 hours and just watched the tide roll in, and just kept getting up every 10 minutes or so and taking more photographs as the tide, you can see it kind of moving up through over the typography here. And it took about 4 hours to cover this rock. And so this is, you can see images here where it became completely submerged. And luckily it wasn't a very cloudy day either, because the clouds were reflecting in the water, any that were there. So I was having to take pictures of, the clear sky. And if there were any clouds, I was trying not to get them in there. And it was beautiful. It worked out really well. So I went back the next day when the tide was back out again, and most of it had actually washed off. So I'm fairly confident that by now all of this is washed away, and I didn't permanently stain that rock. But this was my office that day. This was, sitting outside for 4 hours just waiting for it. But you can see that all of what you see here became submerged when the tide rolled in. And you see over here on the right hand side these like brambles and stuff. It wasn't like a cliff, but it was probably about a 4 or 5 foot drop to down to where the water was. And way off in the distance there where the trees are, that's where the farm was. So what happened when the water came in, I was actually totally cut off from going back to the farm. It was too deep for me to walk through. And I had like my laptop and I had my camera and I couldn't swim. So I ended up having to I didn't plan it very well, but I ended up having to climb through these brambles up into the forest and hike back a kilometer or so, or a mile back to the farm. And so I kind of learned my lesson there about not planning things out. But yeah, so this is the 3 images that came together in Photoshop, and then the end result. And I ended up keeping some of it submerged, but some of it still exposed. And this was the angle that I ended up using for the final. So in the end, I'm satisfied. I'm happy with the end results. But the whole point of this, of me telling you this, is that you don't necessarily need to know what the end result is going to look like. That sometimes your processes along the way are going to dictate that you go in certain directions, or that you make decisions that you didn't think you needed to make, but it's based on the materials you're working with. It's based on the environment that you're working within, and that these things are going to dictate how your work comes into being too. And, Sagmeister was talking at the beginning of that video there, where he finds it very comfortable to have a plan, right? And you work and you work and work until that plan is finished. And that's a very comfortable place to work. But that being said, sometimes being able to give yourself the opportunity to take risks really kind of opens up possibilities for things that are more organic, and your work ends up having a bit more kind of soul to it, when you allow the process to dictate what your final end result is going to look like, and not that you're trying to force square pegs into round holes, but you're just trying to allow the process to see where it's going to take you for the final. Okay. So yeah, so that was my journey with that. And it's different from what you're going through, but I just wanted to kind of share some of the things that maybe you'll want to have to expect if you start working with non-traditional materials. It may not be on this project, it may be on other projects later on down the road, but this idea of not knowing what the end result is going to be before you start, that can be a really daunting thing. But sometimes the rewards match the risks that are taken.